All right, let's get right into it. Companies spend a fortune on leadership training, but for some reason, consistent leadership behavior is still incredibly hard to come by. So why is that? Why do really well-trained leaders so often drift away from the very standards they were taught? Well, this explainer is going to break down the predictable human constraints that are really driving this inconsistency.
And the problem is pretty stark. Research from Harvard Business Review shows that only about 12% of what's learned in leadership training actually gets applied consistently during daily operations. Just 12%. That's not a small gap, you know. It's a massive failure of execution. Most of that investment is just vanishing. So the real question is, what's going on in that other 88%?
Well, that gap has a name. It's called supervisor drift. Think of it as this slow, gradual, and often totally unconscious deviation from the standards you're supposed to be following. It creates this invisible chasm between the company's big picture strategy and what's actually happening on the ground. And this isn't about leaders with bad intentions, it's a systemic breakdown. To really understand why this drift happens, we've got to look deeper than just skills or knowledge. The root cause is actually found in 4 predictable human constraints that exist in pretty much any workplace. And we call these the FONE factors.
This framework you see, the leadership execution model, really pinpoints the root cause of all this inconsistency. It comes down to those FONE factors, and they are fear, overconfidence, negative impressions, and execution blindness. These are just baked-in human factors that predictably warp a leader's behavior, even when they know exactly what the standard is supposed to be.
So, let's kick things off with that first factor, fear. It's honestly one of the most powerful forces that distorts behavior in any professional setting. It has a way of pushing leaders away from doing what's best and toward doing what's just safe. Now, when we talk about fear in a leadership context, we're not talking about outright panic. What we mean here is risk-averse behavior, actions that put personal or psychological safety ahead of performance. This shows up as hesitation, avoiding that really tough coaching conversation, or putting off a decision because the outcome just feels a little too uncertain.
And this is not a small thing. The data shows that 52%, more than half of employees, actively fear being wrong at work. So when a supervisor feels that same pressure, what's their natural instinct? It's to fall back on what's familiar and safe, the old way of doing things, instead of trying out some new and potentially risky technique they just learned in a training session.
And the consequences of this are incredibly direct. Fear makes leaders dodge difficult coaching moments. It causes them to hesitate on decisions that ought to be simple. It makes them put their own sense of safety above the team's performance. And it leads them to delay action whenever there's uncertainty. Every single one of those behaviors feeds directly into supervisor drift.
Okay, let's shift gears to the second factor, overconfidence. This one's a classic cognitive bias where leaders decide to swap out the organization's official standard for their own personal, familiar methods, usually because they believe their way is just plain better.
So to define it formally, overconfidence is a bias where a leader sees their own approach as superior to the prescribed one. This is often tied to something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where a person is just blind to their own performance gaps. They aren't trying to be defiant. They genuinely think their way works better, which of course leads to all kinds of unintentional deviation. This visual here really shows that substitution happening. On the left side, you've got the intended organizational standard. That's the official, validated process. Then on the right side, you see the leader's personal approach, the comfortable method they assume is better. Overconfidence is what causes a leader to just swap one for the other, and that's what creates all that performance variation between different teams. The third factor is all about avoiding negative impressions. This is about impression management, that really powerful, very human need for a leader to look competent, totally prepared, and in control all the time. So we define this as putting impression management ahead of actual performance. A leader who's driven by this will focus on highly visible tasks that make them look effective, right? But they'll neglect the less visible but often more critical leadership functions. Why? To avoid any situation where they might look uncertain or unprepared.
And the data here is pretty compelling. A staggering 69% of managers say they feel uncomfortable communicating with their own employees. A huge reason for this is that fear of appearing unprepared. And that discomfort leads them to avoid the very conversations that are absolutely essential for creating alignment and clarity. So the behavioral results are pretty easy to spot. These leaders will hide their confusion instead of asking for help. They'll prioritize being busy over doing critical work. They'll avoid seeking guidance. And they'll project this false confidence that, in the end, just hurts the team's alignment.
And all of this brings us to our final factor, which is execution blindness. This is a big one. It's a leader's fundamental inability to accurately see their own drift from a standard or the performance problems it's creating on their team. You see, leaders who are dealing with execution blindness are often totally unaware that their behavior has drifted at all. They just can't see the small deviations in their own actions, and they can't recognize inconsistent performance across their team. And that means they have no way to proactively step in and correct the course. This quote from Leadership IQ illustrates a key symptom perfectly. If only 29% of employees always know if they're meeting expectations, well, that signals a massive breakdown in feedback. It's this exact lack of clear, consistent feedback that fuels a leader's own blindness to what's really going on. The consequences here are really significant. These leaders can't spot performance differences between team members. They can't stop drift before it gets out of hand. They misdiagnose the root cause of problems. And, maybe most importantly, they genuinely believe their execution is perfectly aligned with standards, even as they drift further and further away. So what happens when you put all four FONE factors together in a real work environment? Well, they don't just add up, they actually feed off each other. Together, they create this self-reinforcing cycle of inconsistency that becomes a major vulnerability for the entire organization.
This diagram on the screen shows you that cycle in action. You can see how supervisor drift is constantly being fueled by the FONE factors, creating this vicious feedback loop. This really shows why leadership inconsistency isn't just a simple skill gap that you can fix with more training. It's a system vulnerability that demands a systemic solution, an execution system built to break that cycle and bring things back into alignment.
The underlying research for this analysis is recorded in the following publications:
DOI 10.5281/Zenodo 1794-16. DOI 10.5281/Zenodo 1742-56, ORCID 0009-0004-6525-5634.
Published by the Leadership Execution Institute.